Hi, I'm Mark, and I like to talk about UK politics and Brexit from an outside view. Although I do know the UK from the inside as well. The decline of the British Conservatives began with Boris Johnson and Brexit. They have ruined the country, and the contempt for the party is felt everywhere. The public's verdict could not be more merciless as well. The contempt for the party was felt everywhere, as I said, and Sunak was recently booed by the audience in a TV studio with shouts of "shame on you." And the weekend there, even the Sunday Times, run by Rupert Murdoch, came out in support of Labour, an important signal in the British media landscape. The Conservatives have lost the right to govern the country, as the commentary said. The party must regroup in opposition, resolve its internal disputes, and stop blaming everyone else for its own misery. But how could it happen that the 190-year-old Conservative Party, the party of Margaret Thatcher, has now failed so badly after 14 years in government? In fact, the Tories were always the party that rejected ideological experiments, that proceeded cautiously in fiscal policy, that had high moral standards, and that respected the country's economic interests. But as a reminder, before Prime Minister David Cameron took over the government in 2010, the country had experienced the longest economic boom since the Second World War under New Labour, with a boom in the financial sector. But the boom benefited the middle class in the south of England, not the economically neglected north and the working class. The latter suffered from the immigration of workers from Eastern Europe who worked for low wages but were not enough to feed entire families in Great Britain. When the financial crisis and recession set in, the frustrated public voted for the Conservatives in 2010. The then Prime Minister David Cameron, who initially governed in a coalition with the Liberals, was in a tricky situation. The looming debt crisis forced the British government, like the southern European member states of the monetary union, to cut costs. Cameron and his Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, imposed a draconian austerity program on the authorities, from which the public sector has even not yet recovered. Cameron also did not use the low interest rates at the times to invest in infrastructure, in schools, hospitals, and new prisons. That is a failure that the country is still suffering from today. The question at the time was, how should the British economy become competitive again, grow and provide the public with a better standard of living? Those hardliners in the party who believed that the economy could recover more quickly, freed from EU regulations, all this, they believed they had the answer. When Cameron was then unable to stop the influx of workers from the EU, Brexit seemed to be the supposed answer. The Labour opposition, under its then leader Jeremy Corbyn, propagated the change from a free market economy to socialism as an alternative model. Cameron had hoped that Brexit would be rejected in the 2016 referendum, silencing the hardliners in the party. But he underestimated how easily the public could be enchanted by populism, also by lies and the beautiful promises of unicorns by Boris Johnson. Johnson and his hard Brexit were elected by a large majority then in the 2019 general election, after a brief interlude by Theresa May. The country's political centre judged at the time that Brexit is better than socialism. But with Johnson, the party's decline began. In order to push through a hard Brexit, Johnson purged the faction of the most important Brexit opponents. But these were voices that had insisted on the old values of the Conservative Party, on compliance with the rule of law and the democratic separation of powers. Johnson threw these values overboard. Not only did he have his wife decorate the apartment in Downing Street with gold-decorated wallpaper. Just as self-righteously, he plunged the country into the greatest ideological experiment since the Second World War with a hard Brexit. To do this, he systematically undermined British democracy. He attacked the independent judges who enforced Parliament's say in Brexit. He boycotted the press and denigrated the ministerial officials who asked critical questions. He instrumentalized Queen Elizabeth II in order to be able to suspend Parliament, prorogation, which the Supreme Court overturned as unconstitutional. He lied to Parliament about his COVID parties and tolerated breathtaking corruption among his party colleagues. That was really a time that I personally will not forget for quite some time. But the public was horrified. More than 60% of voters are now convinced that Brexit was a mistake. They have not forgotten the image of the Queen alone in church mourning the death of her husband Prince Philip during COVID, while Johnson celebrated in Downing Street. The ideology-driven incompetence of the cabinet took its revenge. Britain had in the end more corona deaths in relation to its population than any other Western European country. And symptomatic of how much power had gone to the heads of those in power is the casual pose which, with, for example, JRM lounged on the parliamentary benches at the time. Serious politics was out of the question, not even when the Tories hardliners' attempts to push through the neoliberal ideas of drastic tax cuts with their new Prime Minister Liz Truss without having the money to do so. That's why she was deposed after 49 days, ridiculed, the thing with the letters. And then came Rishi Sunak. Like many of his cabinet colleagues, he came from a culture that saw the EU as an injustice. After all, before Brexit, EU workers were given free access to the labour market, unlike workers and families from India, Pakistan, Iraq or Nigeria. Sunak did stabilize the country's precarious fiscal situation and negotiated the Windsor Agreement with Brussels, which facilitated trade with Northern Ireland. But he repeated Johnson's mistake. He moved the party even further to the right politically in order to stop the exodus of voters to the Reform Party of the populist Nigel Farage. Sunak did not realize that this meant he was losing the much larger political center of voters. The idea of deporting boat refugees to Rwanda and, if necessary, leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, for example, appealed to the right of the political spectrum, but put up voters in the political center because of the illegality of the policy. And the political approach also failed. The number of boat refugees has risen to a new record, and not only that, legal net immigration is higher than it was before Brexit. And after all, the cheap labor that the country needs has to come from somewhere else now. The fact that the Tories have forgotten how to govern because of their internal squabbles is now taking its toll. Since 2010, there have been 5 prime ministers, 7 chancellors of the exchequers, foreign and home ministers each, 9 education ministers, and 13 housing ministers. Government work wasn't possible, and hence the public feeling that nothing in the country is working anymore under the Tories. The care system has not been reformed and therefore cannot admit patients from hospitals quickly enough. The waiting list for medical treatment in the healthcare system has risen to 7.5 million patients, and the response time for ambulances in the event of a heart attack is half an hour. More than 4 million children live in poverty. More than 3 million people regularly visit food banks. And schools lack the most basic resources, just as glue sticks for lessons, unless the corroding concrete ceiling fall into the classrooms. Inhumane conditions prevail in the overcrowded prisons, so that criminals are released early. And it takes almost 2 years for crimes to be decided by the overwhelmed courts, and not to mention the potholes on the streets. And even the military is underfunded, has too few personnel, too few weapons, no matter how much Johnson advocated help in the Ukraine war at the time. In terms of security and defense policy, the United Kingdom is on the sidelines outside the EU because Johnson wanted it that way. And nothing has come of the new trade agreements with the USA, the higher economic investment, and the supposedly lower food prices after Brexit. Despite all this, the tax burden is at its highest level in 70 years. After 14 years of Tory government, the public's real disposable income is 7% higher than it was in 2010. This means that voters have hardly any more money in their pockets than at the beginning of the Tory era, and there are no longer even doctor's appointments. After 14 years of disastrous politics, the public no longer listened to Sunak, no matter how much he promised that he would cut taxes and solve all the problems under his leadership. The British assumed that he and his family will soon move to California. All that Sunak has had left in recent weeks are angry appearances in which he painted the supposed horror scenario of a Labour government that would tax voters in all walks of life. Added to this was the battle cry that the country must not surrender to Labour. And the Tory statement dutifully printed in the country's right-wing newspapers that Starmer would drive the country into ruin just within 100 days. In reality, Tory MPs were already betting on their own demise on election night, hoping to squeeze a little extra money out of their lost positions. It was a disgraceful end to a once great party that had lost its moral foundation. And Thursday only showed how great the tragedy is that the party's voters missed out on. And there must something happen in the Tory party, of course. But the next weeks will decide the final fate of the Tories if they indeed move even further to the right. I don't see a very bright future there. But if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.